Excellent. We are live on YouTube. Excellent. So I would like to welcome everyone to the DevOps online meetup. So we have, would like to welcome Brendan O'Reilly to the June edition to the DevOps online meetup. So we want to thank Brendan, of course, for being here and also for giving us an electronic copy of one feature at a time. So I'm going to be dropping into the chat a link for a form so people can enter that. But Brendan, while I do that, why don't you introduce yourself to the crowd here at the DevOps Online Summit?
Great. So I'm a reluctant author is probably a good way to start the description, and I came late to that idea, primarily as a consequence of lockdown, but more because over the sort of 30 odd years I've been working in the technology sector, I had attended a lot of conferences, grown through a couple of different iterations of a career that involved big multinationals with open systems and then databases, and then into tools, building software tools. And over the last 5 years, in particular, when I was working with the European Space Agency, when we started working with agility and quality, those kind of juxtaposed concepts, and then into DevOps, where it was kind of, speed and quality. And faster releases. And all the time I was attending conferences and so forth, but I wasn't listening or I wasn't hearing people speaking to the kinds of topics that my customers were speaking to me about. So, so that's the rationale for the book and a brief history of who I am. The company, Dacia DevOps, so we work with clients to help them, deliver digital transformation. That's a very broad church, but that is predominantly through private training, workshops, and we also have a little side to our business, which is tooling. We work with those good people at Atlassian, but more often than not, we do kind of tool strategies, that kind of stuff, software development, lifecycle tool strategies. So
excellent. Excellent. Well, I just want to remind everyone, Brendan's going to have a presentation here, so I can let you share if you want to start us off, Brendan. But I want to remind everyone, if you do have questions, I know some people will be viewing this now, and then also it'll be recorded and shared on YouTube. If you have questions, feel free to pop them in the chat. So Brendan, if you want to share your screen and kick it off.
Great. So, yeah, and I guess because you have a Zoom session open on your YouTube, Tom, if you have questions, you can drop them into the chat, the shared chat with me, and I can...
Sure. Yeah, I'll ping you if something comes up.
Yeah, so I'm working on the assumption that I've got about 30 minutes, and I'm planning... I'm quite happy to stick to the script, but I'm more than happy to be diverted into an area that people are interested in. So let's talk a little bit about the things that my clients were preoccupied about and that caused me to want to write the book. So the start for a lot of my clients' journeys is that they tend to come to me and talk about, process and tools, and they seem to think that that's the difficult part. And actually, I personally shared that view back in 2015. But the more I engage clients, the more I discover that really it's changing how people behave towards one another, and that's affected by appetite for risk, organization structure, the tech stack. There's a whole bunch of things, but we really saw our clients struggling to change how people behave towards one another. And I began to realize that if you could achieve that much to start with, then it would be easier to change the tools and the processes. But when I listen with the ears of my customers, they tended to have, and my clients tend to be, the opposite of unicorns. So well-established large organizations, and they had two fundamental problems: difficulty in changing how they deliver technology. So, how could they actually keep up with digital competitors, and how could they bring the voice of the customer into their businesses? And in my client's mind, those views were concentrated because the hot tech startups could actually get up and running faster than they could digitally transform themselves. They could turn on a sixpence where our customers were stuck in older rhythms and only releasing features once or twice a year. So the one feature at a time was, in many respects, was a shorthand way for me to sum up the challenge that faced them, from a release once a year to one feature at a time. And the engineering minds, when they hear that expression, they tend to think about the fact that, well, if you only release one feature at a time, or you just patch your infrastructure just in one piece, and it was working, and you only change one thing, well, happiness. We now know where the problem is. We roll back, we fix the problem. But more often than not, it wasn't engineers that were holding the purse strings. It was business people. And what really interested them was the idea that, I could measure value one feature at a time. So a feature was working, happy days. But if it wasn't working, then why wasn't it working? And we start to learn more. So the subtitle is really the focus for the book, which is this idea of cultural debt. So this is the shorthand way to think about this, is that it's companies need to get out of their own way, right? So the corporate culture that they have is in some way and to varying degrees getting in the way of realizing value. A client once said to me that another way of thinking about it is that, we fail to keep promises to our staff. That's a cultural debt that builds up. Then very often the question that you're faced with, particularly in organizations that are looking for purpose or a reason to transform, is, well, why would anyone ever want to release one feature at a time? And I often speak about a company called bookings.com. I guess they exist in the States as well as here, but I know they're a Dutch company, but they're a online travel agent, OTA as they're called. And astoundingly, there's a Harvard paper on this, but they will be running 1,000 concurrent experiments. These are, call them features if you like, or ideas. In a given year, they'll probably run a total of 30,000 experiments. And 90% of these will fail, but it's the 10% that work that really keep them at it. Now, these guys were born in the cloud. There's no legacy tech. There's no cab. The CEO, it's a very flat organization. The CEO won't make a decision unless it's driven by behavior on the website that he can observe. So it's a very different organization. Now, within the book, we look at 10 behavioral blockers, and I'm going to be able to speak to about 3 or 4 of them today, just keeping an eye on the time. I'll see how far I get, but I'm going to drop into the chat now, actually, if I can, a link to a blog about the book. And at the bottom of the blog, so you can share that, Tom. At the bottom of the blog is a link to the Amazon site where you can buy it. I think it's about $15. Most of the examples in the book are about business to consumer businesses because they are easier to describe customer value. But a lot of the work we do is with B2B. So everything that I speak about in the book and everything I speak about now in terms of how you repay cultural debt, it very much applies to any organization. Now, there's one big, enormous caveat with everything I say here today, and that is your context. So in the book, I go into a lot of detail about the problem, the cause, the effect, and how you might solve it. And then there are anecdotes. And those anecdotes put in context why a solution worked at that point in time. And since I don't know your context, you need to interpret everything in the book for yourself and determine what will and won't work. And a lot of that should be done by trial and error, experimentation, ideally. One of the things that I speak about in the book as a kind of a bedrock is this idea of what does culture look like? What does good look like? And I plagiarize wholeheartedly a guy called Ron Westrom, who was a what do you call him, an anthropologist really, or a sociologist, but he worked in mission critical systems like nuclear design system, hospital systems, that kind of stuff. And he looked at and did things like, crash investigations with airlines and stuff. And he said that, if you look at how people communicate with one another, it's a predictor for the culture. So, he talks about pathological, which is sort of power oriented. He talks about bureaucratic, which is consensus oriented. And then he talks about generative as what good looks like, and a culture where new ideas are welcomed. Now, the best way to describe these cultures is by talking about what happens when a messenger brings bad news. Now, in a pathological culture, the messenger is likely to be shot. In a bureaucratic culture, the messenger is likely to be listened to, not heard, listened to, but nobody really wants to own the problem because it's probably quite siloed. Nobody really wants to hear about problems. But in a generative culture, it's generally seen as an opportunity to improve, learn, et cetera, et cetera. So another way of describing generative culture is, in studies, it's been proven that a generative culture delivers comparatively more original value from people on a regular basis. So what does that amount to? It amounts to more discretionary effort, more company-wide social interactions, a more pleasant place to work, people who want to get out of bed in the morning, who stay in the job longer, lower attrition rates, all of the above. So now that we've sort of explained what good looks like for a culture, the next thing is to look at some of these blockers. So let me go in here. Yeah, that's all done. And let's look at the first blocker. And really, there's a huge amount of fear of technology amongst business people. And it's very often not understood by people in technical departments and technologists, because technologists tend to be down in the bowels of getting things to work. And very often they're removed from the customer experience. But the business people, there's a lot of scar tissue out there. They've been involved in projects that under-delivered, that overran budgets. They've perhaps worked in waterfall systems where this has only become clear to them late in the project. Not only is there a fear of technology, but there's a fear of technologists as well. So sometimes these are, in the business people's mind, these are individuals who are indispensable. And they tend to have experience with technologists where systems are brittle, so they break easily, they're not able to keep pace with the business. And this fear, it really does impede an organization's capacity to envisage a brighter digital future. The business people will very often explain this in terms of, hey, we've got tons of legacy here. We've got a lot of our budget is tied up in keeping the lights on. So we have to really go to basics with them and do things like value stream mapping to drive waste out of processes, and to not let the processes that are encoded in tools run the business, to actually take a step back. And value stream mapping, of course, brings the customer in, the voice of the customer through. And it's very much based on, let's do more with what you currently have, but let's stop spending money on systems that aren't adding value and find ways to add value. Now, I think the best way to change the C-suite, and sorry, I use that C-suite, I should explain, I'm not sure if it's an expression in the US, but anyone with the word chief in their job title, it covers it. So chief marketing or chief product officer. Invariably for us, it's chief technology or chief information officer. I always think of the chief technology officer as somebody who's building the new stuff, and the chief information officer is really somebody who's looking after the farm, so to speak. And there was a guy called Wendell Willkie, a famous American business thinker, who said that education is the mother of leadership. And so really the best way to overcome leaders' fears is to start thinking and talking about peers, organizations that are peers for your bank or your insurance company or your manufacturing business. Talk about their end results. Talk about, like if our competitor or our peer is doing X amount more profit, has a better share price, better market share, let's look at why that's happening and how come they seem to be more responsive and we're not. Now, very often you're going to be dealing with, at least in our customers, we're dealing with what I call sort of the reluctant CEO. This idea that the best way around a CEO like that is to make him feel that the best ideas are his, especially if he's a kind of an old school kind of command control type individual. Now in the book, I profile about 10 or 11 different CEOs and ways and means to get around them and work with them. And some of them, of course, have been brought in to transform the business. And that's a really good place to be. I mean, I recognize as well that it's really hard to persuade a CEO when the numbers are good. There's a guy called Charles Handy that I quote in the book. And the central theme of his book, The Empty Raincoat, is what brought us to here won't bring us forward. because the world changes. Products die off and new products come in. So this kind of complacency very often displaces curiosity, and you really want this. That you really do want the curiosity. You want people to be curious. So education for a CEO or a COO and so forth, it might take the form of a site visit. It could be books. It could be YouTubes. Ideally, the CTO is somebody who can augment a C-suite and help them to realize the opportunity that technology presents. It's best, of course, if that opportunity is sort of realized, for want of a better word, as a business benefit. So, hey, we can catch this competitor. The book is full of anecdotes, and I'm just going to throw one at you now. I was just thinking about it before the presentation. One of my better clients has a CEO who's probably recognized as one of the better ones in Europe. And about 6-7 years ago, he was dominating throughout Europe. His business was absolutely humming. His compound annual growth relative to his competitors was greater. The cost of his product was substantially less, so he could really beat up the competition on price because he had a really tight, lean cost base. And in one European market in the UK, he suddenly noticed this startup was hurting him. And he went and he took a look at it. He looked, what are they doing that I'm not? And he actually realized that their tech was better. And then he went and he actually spent time with Airbnb. They had a non-exec director in common, and he spent a week with Airbnb. And he came back and he said he decided that technology was inhibiting his progress. So he turned the thing on its head, and within 6 months he had a new CTO. He had a team of about 300 people, and he turned the digital experience around. And that to me is great leadership, because it was seeing and smelling a threat, even though his numbers were outstanding. So that's the first blocker. Let's look at the next one. These are the helpful suggestions. So share a case study. Now, let's talk about fiefdoms. So people talk about silos, but I talk about fiefdoms because fiefdoms infer that there's a prince of some sort, or royalty of some kind who is in charge of the silo. Quite possibly this is a strong character. Possibly he has, got a unique culture within the silo that he's running. I'm a reader of Machiavelli, and people always think he wrote a book called The Prince, but actually he himself wasn't a prince. He was a consultant to the princes, and he used to advise them. And when he got his advice wrong, he used to end up getting tortured in jails, right? So he lived very much on his wits, and had plenty of time to reflect and write books when he was in jail. So, the modern equivalent, I guess, is the CTO who runs foul of the CEO because, things haven't panned out. So, this is a really kind of a real challenge, because very often the insights into customer needs are buried in the silos. But when we come to building teams, like delivery teams, then we need to have those customer insights allied to the skills that can help us unlock the value. And I personally like that delivery team concept. It's been I live in Ireland, but just across the water is the United Kingdom. They've transformed their UK government. It's called the Government Digital Service. They've become extremely agile. They have excellent services, e-services for their citizens. And they define a delivery team as, up to 10 people with all of the skills and resources they require to deliver one feature at a time into production. Now, to do this in the real world, of course, you must align individuals' interests with company goals, and that's really obvious. But one technique I have noticed that works really, really well, and I've seen this across a couple of the companies I work with, is where you have these fiefdoms, and you're trying to, unblock the things that are stopping you from realizing value. If the CEO pulls these together, so it might be the COO and the CTO and maybe the chief marketing, pulls them together and says, hey, I want you to be urgent and I want you to unblock things. and only come to me if you have a problem. Now that group of individuals kind of loses face if they have to go to the CEO. So they really need to be able to sort of sort out between themselves. And the delivery team, when it comes to them with something that's blocking them, very often it relates to some level of communication between the fiefdoms. So that's my suggestion for the delivery teams. And one of the things that I've done in the book is in an appendix in plain and simple English language, I have described definitions of done and how you evolve done, how you might start with, we integrate our code once a quarter, through to an engineer will commit code and it'll go either all the way into production and be live with monitoring on it to show how the feature is being used, or the engineer will get some message back to let him know where he's broken the build or not been able to deploy for whatever reason. So for me, when you're trying to get attention, particularly when we go into client accounts, it's nearly the first thing we do is let's talk about where we are right now. Very often what you'll hear is siloed definitions of done. So my code coverage is 90%. Well, that's not much good if the customer's feature hasn't been live or it's sitting there waiting to go live because the guys in some other team aren't able to actually deploy the feature. So done must be agreed and shared. And once you start the debate, then stand back and listen, listen to people as they debate it out, so to speak. Let's talk about the next one, which is people are afraid of taking risk. I mean, it's clear that in pathological and in bureaucratic type organization structures, people won't take risk. But I think the key to this is to actually identify what a risk is. A risk isn't some blind bet. It's a small experiment for which the outcome is known, the bad result is known, is understood, and the risk associated with that is acceptable. So you break down anything that you want to do that looks big into small little plan, do, check, act type bursts, and then you encourage people, ideally, to do things from a leadership position where you're saying to them, if that's a small risk and we can agree that it is, then why don't you go ahead and do that and seek forgiveness if it doesn't work, rather than looking for my permission to do things. And that's kind of something you want to evolve with. Let's talk about this one here, which is ignoring the competition. Now, there's a whole bunch of reasons why people ignore the competition. Monopolies, of course, well, there is no threat. Very often it's that complacency or overconfidence, perhaps it's over-reliance on a brand. So one of the things we do is a kind of a digital fitness workshop. And what we do is we for the client, we'll find out, who's the gorilla in their space. Is there a tech startup that's moving quickly? Is there a poorly run company? Is there a really good company? And then we capture this data. So, using something like LinkedIn, we can look and see, well, how many people actually have authentic roles? I mean, one example of this is you'll see people who were project managers last month and now they're calling themselves product owners. That's just putting lipstick on a pig. The guy hasn't done a training course, doesn't understand what the change that's required is. So we're looking at the number of authentic roles out of the total size of an IT team, because let's take the bad company. Unfortunately, one of my clients experienced this, a CEO came in to drive change and brought in a really good bunch of people. They were starting to crank. Then the CEO left, and the next CEO decided that he didn't need to maintain that change. And there wasn't enough forces for good and forces for change. There was forces for inertia, and they took over. So if this ratio is wrong, then yeah, it's a problem for the company. Not a problem for you if you're down here and competing with them. And you need to look at, well, have they started to bring in new leaders? Does it look like they've reorganized? Are they flatter? And when you look across all of these kind of pieces of data, what you're actually trying to find out, is there a correlation here? So this great company, right, they've really got a whole bunch of, the right roles. As a percentage of the IT team, they're pretty good, more than 80%. And here's their response time. And you'll probably find that it's the market that's setting the pace more than anything else. And then you start to measure up yourself and you now say, well, are we digitally fit? And the key to this is, asking yourself, are we chasing and disrupting them? Are we chasing them? Or are they disrupting us and chasing us? And you definitely want to be the hunted, you know, I definitely want to be the hunter rather. You don't want to be the hunted. I'm coming to the end of the presentation at this point. So let me just very quickly skip through the last, my top tip, research a competitor. The other things, you need to stop looking at IT as cost and start to look at customer value. We need to get a hold of the finance function and start talking about expensing in the P&L, the cost of building software rather than putting it onto a balance sheet. Where we have low levels of innovation, we need to democratize it. Everybody can have a good idea, and we need to put a framework in place for that. Introducing a culture of innovation, perhaps a hackathon is a good idea. People have fear of new ways of working, but you can't just take away their old ways. You've got to give them something new. Scientific, experimental driven ways of working are very useful. And you can take a discovery, take a small piece of something that you're doing and say, why don't we try to maybe set a nice ambitious hypothesis to say, hey, we could have our service level agreement for our customer policy renewals. How would we go about doing that? Governance can disable. So, my suggestion here is that you could get, if you're stuck with a cab, that you could get them to approve automations once, and only if you change the automations do you ever come back to them. So you gradually ease into the approval process, getting to a place where the customer sets the pace. And then I think the last one is this fragmented organization. I'm not talking about silos within IT now. I'm talking about across an entire organization. And clearly, what we need to get to is a place where teams are united by a mission. So I have now, Tom, arrived at the point of the 30 minutes. I've shared the blog article. This is what it looks like. There's the homepage. You can, if you want to, I publish blogs reasonably relatively often. You can go down there and subscribe, and just at the very bottom of the article, you'll see the link to the book itself.
Excellent. Tom, excellent stuff there, Brendan. I appreciate you sharing that. That was a lot of good stuff. I was taking a lot of notes, and I thought it was interesting you started with Ron Westrom. I know there's a lot of other people have kind of talked about his work. I think it's affected seems like a lot of people in the DevOps space are looking at that because it's so important.
Yeah, I mean, he's a good read. He's been around for a while, and I certainly find it useful as a shorthand means to communicate what good looks like with clients. So yeah.
Yeah, that's important to think about what good looks like, because I just was thinking in my mind, I was going through those three and thinking, okay, I've been at different places, like where has one been like pathological, bureaucratic, and generative, and just trying to think about that. It's a good way of kind of looking at our work environments and how we, like you said, welcome ideas or not. It's a good way to gauge.
Yeah,
so.
Absolutely.
Well, thanks so much, Brendan. Appreciate you sharing that with us. We only have a few minutes left. So, of course, I want to thank you, Brendan, for spending some of your valuable time here with the group on the DevOps Online Meetup. I do want to tell everyone to join us. We have another meetup coming July 15th at 2 p.m. Eastern. We have standardizing SLO and event-driven automation with Andy Graber is going to be here. I'm going to drop a quick link into the chat here just so everybody wants to sign up for that. And then I guess the last thing, just wanted to, thank Brendan. And did you have any closing thoughts or things you wanted to share?
No, I mean, come onto the site and have a look at the blog, and we share a lot on LinkedIn, and I love feedback. I mean, I didn't talk about it here in this presentation, but I love good, bad feedback is good because it'll help me to be better. It's the breakfast of champions. So please give me your thoughts, share your thoughts with me.
Yeah, that feedback's so important. I know, especially as myself, a developer too. If we don't get that, we don't know how we can improve, right, Brendan?
That's it. The breakfast.
Excellent. Yeah. Well, I want to thank everyone, and like I said, we'll see you next month. Appreciate Brendan's time. Make sure you check